This is Rough Drafts Welcome,
the podcast where you can mess up, and we can too.
I'm Sachiko.
And I'm Erin.
And together with the editors at Salt and Sage Books,
we're changing the face of storytelling, one rough draft at a time.
We're glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Rough Drafts Welcome. This is our final episode in our February series talking about romance novels and how we can be more thoughtful as we write those romance novels. Today's episode is all about age gap romances, and I confess that this has been a really tricky episode for me to record for a couple of different reasons, and I'll share many of them as we go through. But the main thing that I want to point out before I actually get into the content that I've planned today is my real genuine desire to not be black and white when we talk about these sorts of things. I thought about it for a long time because I have a really instinctive reaction to a lot of these tropes that we have talked about, as I'm sure you all have noticed as you have listened through. But what I do not want to do is to make sweeping generalizations or blanket statements that say that just because a book uses a particular trope that it's a bad book, or that it's badly written, or that the trope itself is bad. Because I think there is so much room for nuance and for conversations to happen around that nuance, which is part of why I think that writing and book reading and all of that is it's such a crucial part of the broader conversation that we are having as a society. So with all of that in mind, what I finally came to as I was preparing for this one is that the reason that I want to talk about age gap romances and some of the potential pitfalls is that it ultimately comes down to the same reason that I want to talk about sensitivity reading generally. It's that if you do not know what the harm is that you can cause, then you cannot intentionally avoid it. And that is really what I want to be empowering all of you to do as writers and as readers and as creators all across the board, is that you are aware of the things that can happen or the things that can be triggered or unintentionally validated by what you are writing. And so today we're going to talk about age gap romances, some of the potential pitfalls that I see within this, and just maybe some broader cultural context that would be helpful to understand if you are going to write an age gap romance. Now, again, this does not mean that I'm opposed to age gap romances. Generally speaking, it does not mean that I think that they are all horribly bad or that they cannot be done really well. I think they can. My goal is just to give you the information about potential concerns that could come up as you are writing them. So hopefully we will just explore some stuff. I hope you're aware of some of it, especially if this is what you are writing, but if you're not, don't you worry, I've got your back. So, all right, first let us define really quickly what an age gap romance is. It's kind of all in the name, but there is a gap of age between the two love interests. This I have seen done pretty much exclusively in monogamous relationships. It's possible that I'm just not widely read enough in it, but I often see it where the man, and it's almost always straight relationships too. No, that's not true. I've read some really good lesbian romances that have this as well. So at any rate, it is typically a man who is older and then a woman who is younger. You see this particular stereotype played out a lot in Hollywood as well, even if you're actually not aware of it. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But often we see that the man is older and the woman is younger. Lately, there have been a couple romances that I have seen where that has been flipped, where the woman is older and the man is younger, but those, in my experience, are more rare. They are significantly less common. So it tends to be, in a stereotypical way, a cisgendered man and a cisgendered woman. And the man is usually older and the woman is usually younger. Now, of course, this happens, as I mentioned earlier, it happens all across the spectrum in queer romances as well. I'm primarily going to focus on the straight versions of these books because they just, in my opinion, tend to be a little bit more problematic. I feel like writers who are writing queer characters just see, okay, this is where I'm feeling myself saying things that I don't know are actually true. But in my experience, It feels like authors who are writing queer characters tend to be a little bit more aware and a little bit more thoughtful about the way that their representation is going to be reached. Okay, first let's talk about why it is problematic just on its face to have an age gap. It clearly depends for me on the amount of the age gap. So if we're talking like 2 years, 3 years, they are still within the same high school, right? When they went to high school together at some point. Most of the things that I have seen labeled as age gap tend to be closer to 10 years. Some will be like 9 or 8 years. I think the most that I've ever seen was something like 30 years, which I feel like that's a lot, but we'll talk about it. So the other thing that's what an age gap romance is. Sorry, my cat is meowing in the background. I hope you cannot hear him, but he is very upset about something and I'm finding it really distracting. Okay, so the age gap romance, we have the older man and the younger woman, and the actual number of ages, the years tend to differ one way or the other. But they are usually, in my experience, again, they are usually about 10 years apart. I have seen them up to 30. In the research that I did for this episode around books, it seems to be like 8 to 15 years is a pretty sweet spot. I have seen a couple that are like 20 years older, and that's very like, this is often with older characters. That is what I'm trying to say. Sorry, the cat really is like kind of freaking me out. I'm sure he's fine. There are people out there who can help take care of him who are not me. So I've completely lost my train of thought now. All right. So the other thing about an age gap romance is that for me, it really, really, really depends on how old the characters actually are when they meet. And for me, it feels really important to know when they met for the first time. Okay, so stick with me on this. I feel very different about an age gap romance where one of the characters is 35 and the other character is 55. And this is the first time that they have met. I am rooting for them so hard. I want them both to find their love. Yay. Please get together and be so happy, right? But if they have that 20-year age gap and the very first time that they met was actually because he was best friends with her parents and then he was in the delivery room when she was born, I feel significantly more squicked out by that, even if then they did not reconnect until she was 35 and he was 55. This feels gross to me. As soon as you add any amount of child and adult into the relationship, I am no longer okay with this. And the reason why, and this is where we get into like the cultural context that I think is really important to understand, which is that once we get into information about the age of consent, then we have to talk about child marriage and we have to talk about power dynamics. So I want you to imagine this with me, okay? This is a true story. Just imagine, you are living in a polygamist colony, I guess. This is the history from my family history. You're living in a polygamous colony. You are 16, okay? You know that you are right at the age where a lot of girls around you are getting married. There are several men who are your age, and because you are living in a Mormon polygamist colony, I don't know, it's a city, but colony feels like a better word to my brain. Because you are like, there are men around who are your same age. There maybe even be a couple who you quite like. And there maybe are a few who are like in their 20s and you're like, he's kind of handsome. But then what happens is that you are introduced to a 65-year-old. Now remember, you are 16, okay? This is a nearly 50-year age gap. You are introduced to a very older gentleman who is really well known as the town's doctor. Now I use town. He's really well known as the doctor, And he is very well liked, and you have had pleasant experiences with him. He's a nice person. You know his wife. She is also very kind. You have had, they are friendly people in your neighborhood. You like them. And you are then told by your parents, specifically by your father, that you are going to marry him. He is 65. You are 16. And so at that point, you have no choice. Right? And if you know very much about the Mormon faith, and I want to be really clear, I'm very intentionally calling it Mormon. This is my own heritage and my own history. I want to refer to it as Mormon. We could probably get into that a little later. But so at that point, what options do you have when there is this amount of an age gap? And the point that I'm trying to illustrate here is the power differential. Right? So in this particular Mormon community, and in Mormon communities at that point in time pretty broadly, the men are the ones who are in power because they have power not only socially and structurally, but also ecclesiastically. They also have the power to essentially make or break someone. And if you are going to be kicked out of the community, you will be kicked out by men, right? So you pretty much, as a 16-year-old, you have no power. You are also a woman, so you have extra no power. You are also a young woman, so you have extra no power because your father is your immediate superior, and then above him then there's the whole ecclesiastical tower that goes up. And worth mentioning also that this particular gentleman who is 65, who is the doctor, is pretty high up in the ecclesiastical order as well. So when he says jump, the only response that keeps you part of the community and also therefore alive, and it's also important to note that it also keeps you active in the faith that you believe in and that you think is crucial to your lifelong eternal salvation, right? You cannot say no. Even if you object, you cannot say no. So then the only thing that you get to decide in that moment as that 16-year-old girl is whether or not you are going to be happy about it or unhappy about it. And my particular ancestor chose to be happy about it. And so you can read in her journal that she says that she was scrubbing the floors when he came in, and he opens the door and he's backlit from the sun coming in on the side. And she says it was though he was sent by God and he's glowing. And I knew in that moment that this was the man that I was going to marry. And I praised God because he was a good man. And by all accounts, he was not a violent man. He was not cruel. He was very kind to his wives. But still, she had no real choice. So as soon as you introduce a power imbalance into that age gap relationship, you run an incredibly real risk of putting your younger character into a position where they have no choice. And they either have to gaslight themselves into feeling like it's okay, or they are going to really, really, really struggle. And I'm not necessarily trying to say that my ancestor gaslit herself, although I don't understand how you could personally be okay with marrying somebody that much older than you. They then went on to have 10 children. I don't know, right? It's a whole thing. So with all of that in mind, as soon as you have a power imbalance, for me, it becomes really icky. And the power imbalance can sometimes be a really subtle thing. We have pretty obvious power imbalances where it's oh, I'm falling in love with my boss, and my boss is 20 years older than I am, or trying to think of another one, and all I can think now is religion. But your boss, or your personal trainer, or somebody who is in some sort of a position where they can tell you what to do, and you feel obligated in some way, shape, or form to do that thing, right? I find this incredibly, it just makes me shudder. Stories about people falling in love with their teachers. I usually see this done in university settings, which thank you so much for not putting them in high school, because Pretty Little Liars just was a really difficult watch for me. I actually didn't finish watching it after I realized what was happening. All that said, whenever there is any sort of power imbalance, you have an additional layer of weirdness that is going to happen within your story. And I understand that a power imbalance can be an incredibly intriguing thing to work through, and I think it can be done really well. I've read some incredible books that have this age gap romance in them where they also have that added friction of a power imbalance, but that they've worked it out and it has been done really well. But I think you cannot approach it carefully unless you know that it's there. So as you are beginning to write your book, or as you're reading these books, I think it's really important to take a look and say, okay, what are the power dynamics here? Is this person allowed to say no? Because if they are not actually allowed to say no without consequence, this is not to say like, oh, he wouldn't let her say no or anything like that. No, if like they might be physically capable of saying no, but if they are not capable of saying no without receiving consequences that will impact them in a large way. Like, okay, but if you say no, you're going to lose your job. If you say no, then you're going to fail the class. If you say no, then you're going to be kicked out of this religion that is your home. Then that is not actually a choice. At that point, you are not consenting, or your character is not consenting to anything. If they feel like they cannot say no, or if the consequences for saying no are so high that it would cause them some sort of harm to say no, then that is not consent, and that is not a choice. It is not a choice at that point. And I think that if you ever put your character in that particular position, it really behooves you as an author to notice that that is what is happening and to name it. Because I think this is where it comes back into the things that we read are really important for the way that we understand ourselves and the way that we move through society. And I've talked before about how romance novels, for me, were a really important aspect of how I started looking at my own relationship and understanding things about it with my spouse. But I think that if you can acknowledge that is what is happening, then you give power to people who are in those situations to realize that that is what is happening. That if you cannot say no without fear of retribution or consequences, then it is not actually a choice that you are making. What you are choosing in that moment is survival. You are not saying yes. It is not enthusiastic consent. So can it be done well? Absolutely. I have seen it done well, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that particular dynamic. When I have seen it done well, I have really appreciated when the character who is in the position of power is the one who acknowledges it. And they're like, I don't feel comfortable with this actually, because you cannot say no to me. And therefore I cannot trust your yes. When you say yes, I do not know if you mean it or if you are saying it because you want to stay safe. And that for me feels just like, oh, amazing. It is. I love it when that happens. Okay. Age of consent and power dynamics. The other thing that we need to talk about is age of consent, which is, there is a really big difference. I've already touched on this a little, between 15 and 35, right? Versus 55 and 85 or 75. There is a big difference. This is me trying to do math on the fly. There's a really big difference in those two situations because of the age of consent. Now, alarmingly, in the United States, there is actually no federal law that bans child marriage. This should be concerning to you, if you wondered. So marrying before 18 was legal in all 50 states until 2017, when individual states started changing the rules. So until 2017, okay, that was not that long ago. 7 years? 2017, okay, it was legal in all 50 states for people under the age of 18 to be married. In some states, they had to have their parents' permission. They had to have them sign, but in other states, they didn't. But okay, this makes me feel so gross on my insides. So only 10 states have actually banned the practice of child marriage as of today. So, and child marriage, we are defining as the marriage between someone who is under the age of 18 and anyone who is, well, actually just anyone who is under the age of 18, because it could be two children marrying each other as well. So if you are under the age of 18, it was legal until 2017 to get married in the United States. So only 10 states have actually banned that practice. And some states have raised the minimum age, like they call this the age floor for marriage. And you can go and do a bunch of research about this. Just be fairly warned that it will probably leave you feeling kind of sick to your stomach. Some states have raised the age floor to 16. Some have raised it to 17. But 8 entire states in the United States have no age floor for marriage. And I hope that you can immediately understand why that is a problem and that I don't have to spell it out for you. But just in case you are like, wait, I don't get what the issue is. I was married before 18. I am not trying to come for you specifically, okay? I'm saying that the system as a whole is one that creates a legal space for child abuse and CSA. I don't want to say the S word in case you have people listening who are younger along with you, but CSA is legalized. That is what I am feeling. And there is a P word that starts with PEDO that you might also be familiar with. This to me feels like legalization of that. Okay. So I feel incredibly strongly that this is wrong. And when you tie it into all of the concerns that we've already raised about power dynamics and power differentials that naturally come within age gaps, we have a really fertile breeding ground for some pretty horrific things to happen. And now it's also important to talk about, let me find where I was. It's also important that we discuss how circumstances, culture, and era are all going to play a really serious role in this and whether or not it is acceptable to the culture or not acceptable to the culture, and also what your readers are going to find acceptable or not acceptable. Obviously, if you are writing in the dark romance space and you are wanting to explore some of these darker things and you're going to talk about them and like shed a whole lot of light on a lot of the problems that happen, like more power to you. Thank you so much for writing on behalf of the people who are just kind of, and the children specifically who are just kind of disappeared into the system. I think that it's such a crucial thing for us to be aware of as readers. What I'm not okay with is when that sort of thing is sexualized. See, and now there I said the S word. I could have just said it earlier, but it makes me uncomfortable, okay? Okay, sometimes I listen to podcasts with my kid in the car, and I don't always want to have those conversations. Anyway, so circumstances, culture, era, they all play a really big role in this. What I do want to caution you against is this weird idea that we have in our heads as a culture that historically it was accepted or expected or appropriate for teenagers, for children under the age of 18, for children to be married at a teenage type of age. Man, my cat is at it again. I would really encourage you to do some serious research about that. It is pretty widely accepted that like, oh yeah, if you weren't married by the age of like 26, you were considered a spinster. We've all heard that. But I think as you do the research, and the research that I have done for my historically based projects, is that the age of marriage is actually older than I have been led to believe. So please don't lean on the, oh, well, it was 1871. It was normal for 14-year-olds to get married, honey. No, it actually really wasn't. So please do your research on that. And again, you are going to find differences culturally and systematically. And like if I were to write a historical story about my particular ancestor, 16 was a pretty normal age to get married at that point, normal. But that does not mean that it was right. And within those communities, even where those young marriages were happening, I have just from my own personal history, I have knowledge of a lot of people who really strongly objected to older men marrying very young women. And so even when we have this idea that like, oh, it was normal and everyone did it, there were still people out there who were like, I don't know about this, you guys, and that were not okay with it. So please do your research when you're writing historicals. Please don't just be like, oh, well, it was normal back then to excuse more of the P word, okay? It was not normal. And even if it was culturally normal, you are going to find people within that society who are opposed to it. And if that is what you want to write about, please include the people who were objecting. Please include the people who are objecting. Because when we normalize things in fiction, they become normalized for our readers. And I mean, it's a powerful thing that we can become aware of and really use to our advantage to help move forward causes of social justice that are really important to all of us. Alrighty, the last thing that I want to talk about, two more things really. We talked about when did they meet. I'm going through my list now. How many of you have heard of like the 7+ rule? Like that you are, I heard this first from a friend whose daughter is, I guess she's 19 now, which is a weird feeling to my brain. But the rule is half of your age plus 7 years. Then it is okay for you to date. Unless they are under the age of 18, in which case it is never appropriate. Okay? Okay. Never appropriate under the age of 18. It's just not. Don't date children. Don't date children. Don't put children in romantic situations with adults. Don't do it. Blech, blech, blech. No. Don't you dare. Don't do it. Okay. So the 7+ rule says like if you're 40, half of your age is 20, and then you add 7, so 27. So if you are 40, it would be appropriate for you to ask out a 27-year-old. Whether you personally feel that that is appropriate or not is another story. And I have met some 27-year-olds who I would be like, you are essentially still 18. But again, and it depends a lot on the person at that point. But that can be a decent rule of thumb just to start your thinking. Half your age plus 7. It also does play into the social norms about the whole idea of, man, it's a lot of gender essentialism and a lot of white supremacy, where it's this idea that a man needs time to sow his wild oats, of course. Not with any women, but of course with women. Anyway, I feel angry about that too, that this whole like, oh, a man can go around and be very romantically involved with people. And it's just like, yeah, good job, man. But if a woman does the same thing, then she's shamed. Who exactly are the men meant to be involved with then at that point? It's beautiful double bind of being in a feminine presenting body. But this whole idea of like the man needs to be older and the woman needs to be younger, it plays into this idea that men need time to go out and get a job and they need space to start earning so that they can then support a stay-at-home wife and their family. Now, this was a lot more achievable before we were in late-stage capitalism. I'm looking at you like 1950s and 1960s. Like my grandmother was able to stay home just fine, even though her husband worked at a school and did not have a very large income. But he was still able to support their family on the money that he made. They were able to buy a house. That is not the situation for my family. And it is not the situation for, I honestly can't think of any families who I know where that is the situation. It is different now on an economic standpoint. So I understand, like, theoretically, like, okay, the man has to go and, like, get a job. Okay, sure. And then the woman still needs to be young enough to have children. Okay, sure. But it really behooves you to ask yourself as a writer, why is it that, well, if you do feel this way, but why is it that we often have the man played as older and the woman played as younger? Why is that? And what happens when we try to flip-flop those? And again, remember, we are talking about appropriate age gaps at this point. We have done our half of the age plus 7 calculation. We are not including anybody under the age of 18. Okay? Once we have done that, if you shift them, you will find the older women in those situations being called cougars. We do not have really an equivalent for the reverse. And that's a pretty good sign to you that if we don't have a name for when men are the older one, but we do have a name for when women are the older one, you can be pretty sure that there is sexism at the root of this. For me, it comes down to, this is an incredibly complex subject, and I know that there are people out there who know more than I do about this. So please correct me in the comments, give me more information, tell me where else to look. But so much of it is associated with it's sexism, but it's also ageism, where we have this idea that women are only valuable in so much as they are young and beautiful, right? This is why you see anti-aging products marketed really primarily to women. You see them talking about like, oh, anti-aging eye creams, and you have to have the retinol, and you have to da-da-da-da. All of these things are aimed at women. Oh, you don't want to have crow's feet around your eyes. You don't want to have a sagging jowl line. All of the things, right? We want women as a society, and again, this is the United States, we want women to look young. And calling somebody old feels like such an insult, which I honestly find kind of funny because we are all gonna get old. That's kind of part of the deal. Doesn't mean that you can't take care of your body as you go. And I'm not trying to shame people who find a lot of joy in working on their skincare and making sure that they're taking really good care of their body. I don't feel like that is the same thing. But you see this a lot in Hollywood when like Drew Barrymore, I'm looking at my list now, in The Wedding Singer, there is an 8-year gap between Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler. He's older. In Crazy Stupid Love, they have an 8-year age gap, another 8-year age gap in Bridget Jones's Diary. Enchanted, 8-year age gap. And then we see some other ones who are really, this feels alarming to me. Like in Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts and Richard Gere, they're 18 years apart. And again, can that fit within our whole like 20 plus? Yes, absolutely. Or half of your age plus 7. It can absolutely fit into that. But the question that I want us to be conscious of is why do we have to have women be younger? Why do women have to look like they have not aged? Why is the man allowed to have gray hair? Because then he is called a silver fox. And oh, salt and pepper, and oh, isn't he so attractive? But then when women have gray hair, people are like, oh, she's really let herself go. Or when she is wrinkled, she is like photoshopped the death out of her. And so magically she doesn't look anything like herself anymore. That whole obsession with youth and beauty is really, really, really rooted in ageism and sexism, which all have their roots in white supremacy. So you can learn more about that on your own. And if you guys are interested in us doing a deep dive on that, please just let us know, and we can go into that at quite some time. But as soon as you start to pay attention to the age gap in Hollywood and who is allowed to be old on screen, you will notice that it is incredibly egregious that male actors or actors in masculine presenting bodies their career is so long-lived versus actresses or people who are in female presenting bodies, their careers are very short. And it is a real pity. And the actresses who we have who are older, they are far and few between, and they are often cast in the exact same roles every single time. They're always the grouchy old lady. Or they are the sweet grandma or whatever. So just be aware of that as you are writing age gap romance. I'm not trying to say that like if you have a younger woman and an older man that is like immediately a problem with ageism or sexism, but maybe investigate in yourself why you feel like the woman has to be young, especially if you are writing an age gap romance where for me, when I see somebody who's in their 20s and then the age gap is like they're in their 40s or their 50s, that for me feels like a red flag because your brain literally isn't even done developing until you're 26. And that's if you don't have a lot of trauma and external stresses that are going to make it more difficult for your brain to grow in a healthy and safe and sustainable way. But just get really clear with yourself about why is it that I need the girl to be younger, if you do need her to be younger. Why is that? And why do you benefit from having her I'm thinking about the ways that often women's bodies are described in fiction, specifically if you are doing like a dual point of view swap and we are seeing from the older man, right? And then we are observing the body of the woman. The way that she is often described to me feels incredibly predatory and very like, ooh, here is a pretty shiny trophy for my cabinet. If she wants to be a trophy wife, then it becomes a different story. But if she does not want to be a trophy wife, then we need to get really clear with ourselves about why that is and the sexism that plays into that. Okay, there is so much more that we could talk about with this subject. It is incredibly complicated, and there are so many pieces of nuance to it that I know I haven't even touched on. But hopefully this gives you kind of a groundwork for where to start and what to think about when you are considering the potential impact of the stories that you write if you are including that sort of age gap romance. And on the absolute off chance that someone is here because they looked up age gap romance and they're trying to figure out if the person that they're interested in dating is appropriate for them or not, I would really strongly encourage you to ask yourself, what happens if you say no? Are you allowed to say no without fear of repercussions and without negative consequences? And if you are not allowed to say no, then I would strongly consider leaving that relationship, whether it's an age gap or not, because if that sort of power imbalance exists in your relationship, there really is no way for you to consciously and enthusiastically consent to whatever it is that you are doing. And golly, I just hope that you are all in good, safe, healthy, respectful relationships. That feels really important to me. And as authors, I think it's important for us to be really aware of the power that we wield and the impact that our stories can have on other people. So, yeah, get clear on that for yourself and figure out what it is that you want to do. And if you have those sorts of things in your story that are potentially problematic, if you don't feel like you can see it clearly, Salt and Sage is always here. We would love to help you unpack that and figure it out and help you have a more consent-based, enthusiastic, wonderful, healthy relationship, regardless of how old the characters are, unless they are children. If you are writing about children, you need to stop. Okay. Alrighty, thank you all for joining us. Or joining me, I guess. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate so much that you tune in and that you listen. And if you have any questions you would like us to address, I would love to hear them. If you're listening on Spotify, you can just pop those questions right into the little Q&A that pops up after that. Otherwise, you can leave us a little question down in our Apple reviews. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. Bye.
This has been Rough Drafts Welcome.
Thank you so much for listening.
Got any questions? We would love to hear them. Got a complaint? We'll hear it too.
Yep. Leave us a 5-star review. Pretty please. And thank you. And if you want to book with Salt and Sage Books or learn anything else about what we do, or if you want to work with us or take our courses or blah, 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 you can find us at www.saltandsagebooks.com. And we're all over social media too.
We sure are.
And we'll see you next time.